EAA's webinars are made possible through the generous support of Aircraft Spruce and Specialty, serving homebuilders and EAA members since 1965. Tonight's presentation is titled Don't Shoot Yourself in the Foot. Our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. Numerous aviation publications. He's authored, writer of a couple different books now, and he's a certified flight instructor certificate holder, A&P mechanic certificate holder with inspection authorization, Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, honored by FAA in 2008, and a member of EAA. Continuing in his webinar series, Mike, thank you for volunteering your time to be with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Normally, Tim tries to put up a picture in his little introductory slides along the theme of the webinar, and I noticed he just put up a generic photo of a cub because I don't think he has a clue what tonight's webinar is about.
Oh, that's not a cub, Mike. That's a champ.
Okay, it's a champ.
That's an Iraqi champ. Oh, yeah. We got to be clear about that. Champ is a far superior airplane to a cub, so I'm just throwing it out there for everybody. Talk to you later.
Very good. Very good. Well, anyway, we're going to be talking about tonight a little bit about ways that that aircraft owners tend to sabotage the maintenance of their aircraft by the way they deal with their A&P mechanics. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention, and I mentioned this at the end of the webinar last month, but my new book is available. It's called Mike Bush on Engines, all about piston aircraft engines, pretty much an anthology of everything I've ever written on the subject of piston aircraft engines, brought up to date, plus a whole bunch of new material. Book started out, I was planning on a 250-page book. It wound up being a 508-page monster. It's been getting really great reviews on Amazon and Facebook. It's available on Amazon, and it will be available for those of you who are coming to AirVenture. It will be available in a couple of the EAA stores, the Sky Shop and the bookstore at the EAA Museum. Also, Aircraft Spruce is going to be carrying these some of these books at their set up in the exhibit hangar. So, and I'm going to be doing two. They have me scheduled to do 2 book signing sessions at AirVenture this year. One on Monday afternoon, one on Friday afternoon. So, those of you who are coming to the show, if you bring your copies of the book to one of those book signing sessions, I'd be more than pleased to autograph it for you. Moving on to the subject tonight, I've done a lot of hanging around shops over the years, watching airplanes come and go, owners come and go, listening to A&Ps talk about the owners when they've left, the proverbial fly on the wall. And I've frequently seen cases where owners inadvertently sabotage the maintenance of their aircraft by the way they deal with their A&P mechanics, by imposing inappropriate constraints on their mechanics. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that tonight, because there's the right way and the wrong way for owners to stay in control of their maintenance. One of the things I see a lot that really interferes with proper maintenance of aircraft are the deadlines that aircraft owners frequently set on mechanics. Everybody wants their airplane to be ready on Friday. If you ever hang around a maintenance shop on Friday, it's an absolute zoo, because it's just an eruption of airplanes being buttoned up and pulled out of the hangar for delivery to aircraft owners, because everybody always wants their airplane to be ready by Friday afternoon because they're taking their family on a trip. One of the worst things you can do, well, in general, it's a really good idea not to pick up your airplane on a Friday. But one of the worst things you can do is to put your airplane in the shop, say on a Monday morning for an annual inspection, and tell your IA, I've just got to have the airplane by Friday. I've got a big trip coming up over the weekend. It happens all the time. And the thing is that the annual might have taken a week last year or the year before, and a week might be enough to get an annual done if there aren't any surprises. But maintenance is seldom surprise free, and the whole point of an annual inspection is to look for stuff that's wrong with the airplane that you don't know about. So if you bring your airplane into the shop on a Monday morning, the mechanic need to start opening up the airplane, pulling off the inspection plates, pulling the seats and carpets and floorboards and stuff out of the plane, pulling off all the cowlings and so on. They've got to start going through the paperwork, the logbooks and so on, AD compliance. It's probably going to be Tuesday afternoon, even Wednesday morning, before the IA has inspected everything and knows what sorts of repairs need to be done and what parts need to be put on order. So now we're halfway through the week, and all of a sudden the IA discovers he needs some part that he's going to have to try to get FedExed in overnight to meet your time constraint. There may be some repair that is going to have to get rushed through. In general, the IA and his staff of mechanics are working with a gun to their head. And you know, IAs want to please their customers, and so in a good faith attempt to please you, and maybe even more importantly, to avoid a confrontation with you if your airplane isn't ready when it was promised, he's likely to rush through the work. He's likely to maybe squint real hard and not see as much as he would if he was doing a really thorough inspection, because he knows he just doesn't have the time to get any more done before the end of the week. And so take this scenario, repeat it a couple of years in a row, and you wind up with an airplane that isn't as well maintained as it ought to be. And not to mention that, but in this rush scenario, you're going to be picking up your airplane Friday afternoon as promised, and the mechanic is going to kill himself to get it ready for you on time. And then you're going to be launching off with your family in an airplane that's just out of annual inspection without leaving time for a proper post-maintenance shakedown flight. That's not a smart thing to do. That absolutely drives me crazy when I see my clients doing it. They'll pick their airplane up on a Friday after a heavy annual inspection where all sorts of work's been done, and they'll put the wife and the kids and the dog in the airplane and launch off into a 300-foot overcast. That's a really poor thing to do. I did a webinar a while ago about post-maintenance test flying and about all the things that tend to go wrong after airplanes come out of maintenance. But the most likely thing the most likely time for things to go wrong with your airplanes mechanically is the first flight out of maintenance. And so you don't really want that first flight out of maintenance to be one where you're taking your family off on a trip, particularly if the weather is marginal. At any rate, what I've always done in my years as an aircraft owner, particularly those years prior to the time that I became an A&P myself, and I was dependent on other mechanics in shops for maintaining my airplane. I generally set a rule of thumb that said, whatever you think the annual is going to take in terms of elapsed time, be prepared for it to take twice that long. You can tell the mechanic that you're kind of hoping that it'll be ready for Friday, but don't put a lot of pressure on him to do that, and don't count on it. Don't make plans that where everything's going to be ruined if the airplane isn't ready by then, because there are always surprises that can come up in inspections, and to do the work right can often take longer than you expect if a surprise comes up. And besides, do you really want to be paying for overnight freight on a pair of magnetos and, all the stuff that would be necessary to try to get that airplane done by Friday? And as I said earlier, even in the case of general maintenance, picking your airplane up on Friday is usually not the best strategy, because that's when everybody else wants to pick up their airplane. So plan for the worst, hope for the best. If the airplane's done on time, be pleasantly surprised. If it runs over due to some unforeseen contingency, be happy that your mechanic cares enough to do the job right. So that's the one of the ways that I see owners shooting themselves in the foot by putting inappropriate and unrealistic time pressure on their mechanics. The other thing that I see a lot has to do with sticker shock, has to do with what happens when you get the bill, the invoice. And it's not uncommon that owners get a maintenance invoice, particularly after an annual inspection, and it's a lot higher than they expected. And they get upset and they go fight with the mechanic. This tends to be pretty counterproductive. Arguing over the bill after your aircraft comes out of maintenance, in my experience, is a great way to win the battle but lose the war. Maybe you'll get the mechanic to reduce the bill somewhat, but he's going to remember that. And at the next time you put your airplane in the shop, he's going to remember that you're kind of a skinflint, and he's going to do everything in his power to prevent having an argument over the bill again by deferring anything that's not absolutely critical. Mechanics, in my experience, they have like a little adding machine tape going on in their head when they're working on an airplane. And after a while, they get a sense for what the threshold of pain of each of their clients is with respect to cost. And when they start getting the feeling that the cost of maintenance is getting up close to that threshold of pain, they're going to start leaving stuff out. They're going to start just trying to do everything they can to avoid a confrontation over the bill, because probably the single most the single thing that mechanics hate the most in their job, and it's not getting greasy, and it's not changing bladders in a Bonanza wing, although those things are changing windows with the Pro Seal, although nobody likes those jobs. But the job that your mechanic hates the most is arguing with a client over the bill. And so they'll do almost anything to try to avoid that from happening. So what happens again is that you wind up with a bunch of deferred things, and those deferred items will invariably come back to bite you later, because in the long run, the longer you put the stuff off, the more expensive it's going to be ultimately to resolve. And it's especially painful if the problem is one that bites you when you're away on a trip somewhere. My company deals with a lot of AOG situations because we offer breakdown assistance coverage, and that's probably the most unpleasant thing that happens to aircraft owners as far as maintenance is concerned, is to have a breakdown when you're away from home. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not advocating a money is no object approach to maintenance. Anybody who has ever listened to my presentations at Oshkosh or read my articles or my manifesto book knows that I hate spending money on maintenance, and I will do almost anything to avoid spending one more nickel on maintenance than I absolutely have to. And so I'm a big fan of keeping maintenance costs under control. But arguing over the invoice after the job is done is not the way to save money. It's just a way to alienate your mechanic and cause bad consequences later on. So if you want to keep control over the maintenance of your airplane, what you need to do is get involved early. You don't ever want to have a surprise when you receive the invoice. So the thing you need to do, and I've talked about this before, is when the airplane goes into the shop for an inspection, tell your IA to complete the inspection, make up a discrepancy list, and then to call you as soon as he's completed the inspection and before he starts any repairs or orders any parts. That way you can be involved in the decision process, and the two of you together can decide what work should be done, what work should be deferred, and you will have a real good idea what things are going to cost before you approve the repairs. When the inspection is done and the IA has his discrepancy list done, ask him to write up a time and cost estimate to repair each item on the list, and then go over it with him and decide what work you want to approve, what work you want to defer, what work you want to think about a little longer, or maybe go get a second opinion on. But you need to be involved in it early in the process. If you wait until the work is finished and you get the invoice and then you don't like what you see, it's really too late to do anything about it. All you can do is generate a lot of hard feelings. So you need to get involved early in the process. For items that are not yet safety critical, you and your IA should make a joint decision as to what items should be fixed now and what items should be deferred. If you leave those decisions to your mechanic, you may not like the decisions he makes, because mechanics have a very different set of motivations than aircraft owners do. You want to be involved in those decisions. So you need to be involved early in the process. When you're done going through the discrepancy list with the IA, and you've agreed on what to fix and what to defer, and he's given you estimates for each of the items that you've agreed to repair, you should have a very good idea of what the final invoice is going to be when the work is done. So when you get the invoice, there shouldn't be any unwelcome surprises, and your mechanic will know that his invoice better be pretty darn close to the estimate that he gave you, or he'd better have an awfully good explanation for why it isn't. Again, when we take our cars in for maintenance, there are state laws requiring that the shops give us a detailed work order with detailed cost estimates and get our written approval before they can pick up a screwdriver and work on our automobile. And we shouldn't ever have any surprises when the bill arrives, because we know what it's going to cost up front, and we've approved it. Unfortunately for airplanes, there aren't typically any laws that require that, but you as an aircraft owner need to establish that kind of protocol with your mechanic. So just as with automobile maintenance, you don't wind up having any sticker shock when the invoice arrives. Now, we've talked about that it's important to get involved early in the process, but one other thing you can do is get really involved and really get your hands dirty, because there's no better way for an owner to learn how to work effectively with mechanics and to keep control over the maintenance of their aircraft than to do an owner-assisted annual. When you do an owner-assisted annual, you spend a week or so living at the shop side by side with mechanics. You learn how the process works on your own airplane. You see it happening on other people's airplanes that are in the shop at the same time. And by the time you're done, you have a much better idea of how things look on the other side of the toolbox, and how to constructively work with your mechanics, and what sorts of things you shouldn't do because it really ticks them off. You'll get to hear mechanics talking about other owners. It's a really good experience, and in my view, every owner owes it to himself to go through an owner-assisted annual at least once in his aircraft ownership career. You'll also, in the process, learn an enormous amount about your own airplane. There's nothing like taking an airplane apart and putting it back together to make you comfortable with all the systems in the airplane. Now, most people don't have the time or aren't willing to take the time to do owner-assisted annuals on a regular basis. But even if you do it just once and never do it again, it's a wonderful learning experience. So consider it as a novel vacation idea or something. It's going through it as something that will pay dividends as long as you continue to be an aircraft owner. Tim, that's all of the prepared material I have for tonight. We can open it up for questions. Once again, I'll just mention that the Engines book is available on Amazon. It will be available at AirVenture for those of you who are going to be there, at the EAA Sky Shop, at the museum bookstore, and at Aircraft Spruce. And if you have a copy, I'm going to be doing a couple of book signing sessions at the Sky Shop on both Monday afternoon and Friday afternoon, and I'd be happy to autograph copies. So with that, Tim, why don't we open it up for Q&A?
All right, Mike. Alex has a question here. What do you do when the annual to-do list is agreed upon and the AMP does additional work without consulting you?
Well, that's a real sticky wicket. It's interesting that you brought that up, because just today I was dealing with a situation like that where a Cessna 182 owner contacted me. He had brought his Cessna 182 in for an annual inspection and discovered that the mechanic took it upon himself, for reasons that we don't understand, to remove the propeller from the airplane. And having removed the propeller from the airplane, he saw some very tiny scratches on the mounting holes of the spinner backplate that he called cracks, and was trying to tell the owner that this spinner backplate was unairworthy and that he needed to replace it, and that the mechanic, by pure coincidence, just happened to have another one in stock that he would be happy to sell the owner for $1,500. And of course, there's no annual inspection checklist in the world, not the Cessna 182 checklist, not the FAA's checklist in Part 43 Appendix D, that says that you're supposed to remove a propeller when you do an annual inspection. Nobody does that. So the question is, well, what should the owner do now? And these are difficult things, because the first thing is that when you put your airplane in for an inspection, you have to very specifically give your IA marching orders, and you say, I am authorizing you to open up the airplane and perform the inspection and prepare a discrepancy list, but you are not to perform any repairs. You are not to order any parts until you call me. Because a lot of mechanics just assume that they have carte blanche to do whatever they think is appropriate. I've heard mechanics say, and it really irritates me to hear this, but they say, well, I didn't ask the owner's permission because this was an airworthiness item. I had to do it anyway. Why should I ask the aircraft owner when it's, when it has to be done? And the answer is because it's not your airplane, and it's not your money. And he didn't give you, a blank check or hand over his credit card and say, have a blast. But it happens all the time. As I said, in the case of cars, there are state laws that protect motorists against this sort of thing. When it comes to airplanes, owners have to protect themselves. So the first piece of advice is you always have to be very, very clear. As an aircraft owner, you have to be very clear with mechanics and IAs in terms of what you're authorizing them to do and what you're not authorizing them to do. And in the case of an annual inspection, you should be authorizing them to perform the inspection and document any discrepancies they find. But you should be explicitly telling them that they are not authorized to perform any repairs or order any parts until they have discussed it with you and gotten your explicit approval to go ahead and perform repairs or order parts. Now, that doesn't help this poor 182 owner where this has already happened to him. So I'm advising him to sit down with this IA and say, what on earth possessed you to pull this propeller? There is nothing in this Cessna annual inspection checklist or any other inspection checklist that calls for pulling a propeller, and find and see what the IA's story is. But he better have an awfully good reason for pulling the propeller, or the owner should tell him flat out, you're going to put that propeller back on the airplane, and I am not going to pay you for the labor that you expended pulling the propeller and putting it back on, because you were not authorized to do that and you had no valid reason to do that. The second part of it is there's this spinner backplate in question where the IA is saying it's cracked and needs to be replaced. And I'm going to advise the owner to direct the mechanic to perform a die penetrant inspection witnessed by the owner to determine whether indeed the backplate has bona fide cracks, or whether, as the owner believes, they're just scratches. The die penetrant inspection will determine objectively whether those things have any depth to them and whether there are any cracks involved. If the backplate is not cracked, it should go back on the airplane, and the owner shouldn't be paying for this stunt that the IA pulled. If it turns out that the backplate is cracked, then I will advise the owner to go find the least expensive replacement that he can find, probably at a salvage yard, and then tell the mechanic that he'll either order that spinner, or if the mechanic wants to sell him the one he has in stock, he has to match the price. But these aren't easy situations to deal with. And so the best way to deal with them is to have an understanding, a very clear understanding up front as to what the mechanics are authorized to do and what they're not authorized to do. And it's unfortunate that in aviation, mechanics seem to feel that they can go ahead and do whatever they feel like doing without consulting with the owner. I'm not all mechanics, but some mechanics. It's something that happens with unfortunate frequency. So it's really up to the owner to protect himself. We don't have laws to protect us. We have to protect ourselves, and we have to do so by having a very clear, explicit understanding with the mechanic as to what we're authorizing them to do and what we're not authorizing them to do.
Interesting comment from John. He says, in my opinion, when I have a great mechanic, and I do have them, he said, I tip them when we're done. And in my opinion, the plane is really ready to show him my appreciation.
Well, that's an interesting approach. We've often tipped mechanics with like 6-packs and donuts and things like that. Cash tips are something that isn't traditionally done, but I'm not going to say it's a bad idea. It's certainly a good idea to show your appreciation when you think that they've done a good job for you.
And John says some shops refuse to allow owner-assisted maintenance. Is that in your mind a thumbs down for a shop like that?
No, it's an unfortunate thing. It is getting harder and harder to find shops that will work with owners on owner-assisted annuals. And there are two reasons for that. One is just sort of an increasing fear of litigation that on the part of shops that has taken place. Basically, it's sort of a trend that started in 1994 when Congress passed the General Aviation Revitalization Act of 1994, which basically took aircraft manufacturers off the hook for a lot of liability. It imposed an 18-year statute of repose, essentially statute of limitations on liability claims. And since an awful lot of the GA fleet are aircraft that are older than 18 years old, it basically took the deep pockets off the table as far as plaintiff lawyers are concerned. And that didn't make the lawsuits go away. It just shifted who got sued. So since the manufacturers who had the real deep pockets couldn't get sued anymore in most cases, everybody else who had anything to do with the airplane tended to get sued a whole lot more often. And it used to be in the old days that it was rare for a shop or mechanic to be sued in an air crash case, mainly because most shops and mechanics don't have a lot of net worth. They weren't really worth suing. The guys that were really worth suing were the manufacturers. But with GARA that took the manufacturers off the hook, at least after 18 years, it's much more frequent now that shops are getting sued. So that's kind of one of the reasons that the mechanics are kind of gun shy.
Cammie's wondering, does FAA allow mechanics or anyone for that matter to put a lien on an aircraft without the authorization or agreement of the owner?
Well, it's really not. It's not an FAA thing. It's typically a matter of state law, but most states do provide for something called a mechanics lien. It isn't airplane specific, but generally it does apply to airplanes as well as other things, where mechanics can file in court, in state court, for a lien on an airplane until the owner pays their bill. Because the airplane is really the only thing that they have as collateral. It doesn't happen a lot. It has to be a pretty serious dispute before a mechanic will go get a mechanics lien, because it's kind of a pain to file for a mechanics lien. It takes a while for the courts to process it and so on. So the mechanic will certainly do his best to persuade you to pay his bill before he takes that extreme step. But in most states, and certainly in every state that I've looked at, there is such a provision for a mechanic to file a mechanic's lien.
And let's see here. John says, I'm a new airplane owner. How do I find either a mechanic or a shop to perform maintenance on my certificated aircraft?
Well, there are different ways. There are maintenance consulting and management firms like mine that do a lot of referrals like that. Type clubs are a very good way to do that. If you have a Cessna or Bonanza or a Mooney or something, joining the type club for your particular type of airplane, which typically is not very expensive, it's usually $40 or $50 a year, it is an excellent source of type specific information. And one of the things that type clubs are very good at is providing referrals of good mechanics and shops. There are lots of aviation forums, of course, on the internet. You sometimes have to be a little careful about the signal to noise ratio on some of those forums, but nowadays there are lots of good ways to get referrals. You need to be careful. There are some really excellent shops out there, and there are some really sleazy ones, and so it is worth doing some pretty serious due diligence before you decide who you're going to allow to swing wrenches on your airplane. And that goes double or triple when it comes to annual inspections, because in the case of an annual inspection, if you get into a dispute with the shop that's doing your annual, it takes jumping through a whole lot of hoops to get your airplane out of jail so you can fly it again. Whereas if you're having maintenance done in some other context but an inspection, you can usually just call a halt to it if you don't like the way it's going. But it gets a little more complicated when it comes to doing annuals.
Bart is wondering, how do you put pressure on a mechanic so the annual does not turn into a multi-week ordeal due to slow work by the mechanic?
Well, most the biggest leverage that you have over the mechanic with respect to elapsed time is the fact that until he's done with the work, you're not going to pay him, and he'd like to get his money. That gets really dangerous when shops ask for substantial deposits, and there are some circumstances under which it's legitimate for a shop to ask for deposit if they're having to order some very, very expensive parts that are not readily returnable, but to the extent that you pay for work up front as opposed to in arrears, you're losing leverage. So you want to be pretty careful about when you agree to pay for work up front, and you don't want to do that unless there's a real good reason for it, good legitimate reason for it. You certainly never want to pay up front for labor, but sometimes there's a legitimate reason for a shop to ask for a deposit when they're having to order some expensive component, in the extreme, let's say a factory rebuilt engine or something like that. It's not fair to expect the shop to finance that engine during the 60 days it's going to take to pull the old engine out of the airplane, put the new engine in, ship the old engine back, and so on. So there are cases where deposits are appropriate, but the major leverage you have over the shop is that until they're done and you're happy, you're not going to pay the bill.
Richard is wondering, can a mechanic hold an airplane until a bill is paid, or hold the logbook, or hold making appropriate entries in the logbook until the bill is paid?
Okay, well, those are all good questions. As we mentioned, in extreme cases of non-payment, a mechanic can file for mechanic's lien, which allows him to hold the airplane hostage. That doesn't happen very often, and it has to be a pretty serious dispute. In the case of logbooks, we hear about mechanics holding logbooks hostage all the time, and we very strongly advise our clients never, ever, ever, under any circumstances whatsoever, allow a mechanic to have access to their logbooks. And when I say that, I mean their original logbooks. There is no legitimate reason that any mechanic ever needs access to your original logbooks. All they need is copies. They typically don't need anything except during an annual inspection. During an annual inspection, they need the ability to research your logbooks, but they can do that from copies. So we recommend to our clients that they make digital scans of their logbooks, make those digital scans available to mechanics, and keep the original paper logbooks locked up in a safe place, preferably a fireproof safe somewhere, and never allow those logbooks to leave their personal custody or control. Logbook entries should never be allowed to be made in the logbook. All logbook entries need to be made on self-adhesive stickers. Why? First of all, because you don't want to hand over your logbook. Second of all, because if you don't like the logbook entry, you want to be able to send it back and say, do it over again. And you can't do that if mechanics write directly in your logbook. I've seen some horrendous things that mechanics have written in logbooks. We don't let that happen to our clients, and I strongly recommend that every aircraft owner follow that basic procedure. Don't ever give mechanics your original paper logbooks. Always get all maintenance record entries on self-adhesive stickers, and only if you are satisfied with those entries should you paste them into your original paper logs.
John is wondering, do you recommend a pilot getting their A&P sometime?
Well, absolutely, but it's very hard to do. It takes a long time. If you're not working full time as an A&P, and you're doing it based on the kind of level of work that an aircraft owner typically can do, and doing his own oil changes and spark plug maintenance, stuff like that. In my case, it took me 10 years to accumulate the experience required to meet the criteria for getting an A&P. It's not an easy thing to do. They don't make it easy. And I've often thought that owners of certificated airplanes ought to be able to apply for some sort of a repairman certificate that would allow them to do work on their own aircraft, much as the owner of an experimental aircraft can get a repairman certificate. The FAA shows absolutely no interest in doing anything like that, and I don't really expect that to happen. There is something like that actually in Canada, where Canada has a rule that allows the owner of certificated aircraft that are antiques, that are old and unsupported, to work on their own airplanes. But in the U.S., I don't see that ever happening. It's a shame.
Yeah. Thomas has a comment here. He says, if you spend time in an A&P shop for an owner-assisted annual, you will see the A&Ps rush to try to support the demands of those who have to have their plane by Friday, while getting interrupted to answer the phone, trying to remember where they were when they were working. You will come to the conclusion it is better to let the A&P get distracted while working on the other person's plane and give the A&P the time he needs to do a slow and deliberate work on your plane. For my partnership, Cessna 182 and annual normally ask to have the inspection and then work done in 3 weeks and plan to pick it up in 4 weeks. The A&Ps I've worked with seem to appreciate not being rushed and appreciate giving them the time to do the work right. Call to check how they are coming on Tuesday or Wednesday, not Friday when they are rushed and seem frustrated.
Amen to all of that. That's all very, very insightful. One of the things a long time ago, when I first started doing maintenance on my airplane, this was before I was an A&P, but I did wound up doing the majority of the maintenance on my airplane under the supervision of a bunch of A&Ps who were very, very kind to me and would pretty much sign off whatever I did on the airplane. And I discovered that when I started working on my own airplane, instead of letting the professional mechanics work on my airplane, the airplane got much more reliable. And that was very puzzling to me for a while, because I thought, how is it possible that a complete newbie like me, who doesn't really know what the hell he's doing, can effectively make less mistakes than professional mechanics who've been doing it, as their livelihood for decades. And the answer that finally came to me after a while is exactly the answer that this last question brought up. And that is that when I work on my airplane in my hangar, it's just me, the airplane, the toolbox, and a Bach Brandenburg concerto. There's no telephone, there's no interruptions, there's no roach coach, there's no Snap-on toolman coming by, there's no FAA inspector showing up to check out my paperwork, and I have the luxury of working on my airplane in a distraction-free zone. If you go to a maintenance shop, and this is especially true of smaller GA shops, they are incredible distraction-rich environments. And that's a really bad thing for the quality of maintenance. But there are constant interruptions, customers showing up without appointments, phones ringing, UPS people and FedEx people showing up with deliveries. And the biggest single cause, studies have shown, of mechanic error is distraction. In really large maintenance facilities like say the Citation Service Center in Wichita, Kansas or something, it's much less of a problem, because the line mechanics don't get phone calls. They don't deal with customers. They don't deal with parts deliveries. They probably do deal with the roach coach, but for the most part, there's enough specialized staff there to deal with most of the interruptions, and so the mechanics who are swinging wrenches on the airplanes don't have to do that. They have their own sets of problems because they work multi-shift operations, and there are a lot of mistakes made at shift change time when the incoming shift believes that the outgoing shift did something, and the outgoing shift believes the incoming shift was going to do something, and so it doesn't get done. But as far as distractions are concerned, the big maintenance facilities, and this is also true of the airline maintenance facilities, have a lot fewer distractions. They've got some other problems, but as far as distractions are concerned, they keep them as a minimum. But small general aviation shops tend to be very, very bad with regard to mechanic distraction, and it's a significant cause of maintenance-induced errors.
We've had a couple questions from people about maintenance on experimentals, and as we know, anybody can, do maintenance on an experimental. You don't have to be an A&P mechanic to do that. But we got a question here from Neil. What advice would you have for owners doing their own maintenance, say on a home-built experimental? I have a great mechanic that will assist as needed and lend tools and equipment if I need it.
Well, I think the first recommendation I would make for anybody who is working on the airplane, whether they're an owner doing preventive maintenance or whether they're somebody doing more extensive maintenance on experimental, is to get a copy of the 3 A&P mechanics handbooks and sit down and read them. The FAA publishes the A&P mechanics handbooks. There's 3 volumes, general, engines, and airframes. And they teach kind of the basic rules of the road that I think it's important that anybody who is swinging wrenches on airplanes needs to know. And there's no reason that you need to get a certificate, but it's probably a really good idea to just go through the basic training on a home study basis, because there's some really good stuff in there. I hate to say something really good came out of the FAA, but those books are actually full of really good stuff. There are other textbooks that you can buy for aircraft mechanics study guides and stuff like that that would probably also be useful. But it's not like you're trying to study for an exam. You're just trying to study them for the benefit of your own knowledge. And I think that's probably the primary recommendation that I would give. A secondary recommendation is that if you're doing work that is potentially safety critical, it's a really good idea to have somebody who has done it before show you the ropes the first time. And it's kind of an irony that there's a regulation that requires mechanics to do that. As a certified mechanic, I'm not permitted to perform a maintenance task that I've never performed before, except under the supervision of someone else who has performed it before. But that particular regulation only applies to certified aircraft mechanics. It doesn't apply, for example, to aircraft owners who are doing preventive maintenance, and it certainly doesn't apply to people who are working on experimental airplanes. Although you would think that if anybody needs that sort of guidance, it would be the latter. But it's always a good idea not to if it's something that where you might get into trouble, have somebody who's done it before show you the ropes the first time you do it.
And Paul and Mark were both wondering, would Advisory Circular 4313 also be a good one?
Yeah, Advisory Circular 4313 is certainly good. It's more of a reference, I think, than it is a textbook. I'm not particularly suggesting somebody just sit down and read 4313 1A or 2B cover to cover, because they're big. They're like the New York Telephone Directory, and there's probably a lot of stuff in there that isn't applicable to anything that you're going to be doing. But everybody who works on airplane ought to have a copy of 4313 in order, because it's a very important reference guide. And again, Part 43 of the regulations is not something that applies. It explicitly doesn't apply to experimental aircraft, but all of that stuff still it constitutes best practices, whether the aircraft is experimental or certified, and so it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile having the material.
Leslie's wondering if you could mention again the books that you mentioned just a little bit ago about what you would get for reference material.
Oh, I was talking about the A&P Mechanics Handbook, volumes 1, 2, and 3, and they're FAA publications. They are available, I think, from the government printing office bookstore, but they're also available. Reprints are also available from ASA and places like that. And the A&P Mechanics Handbook is a 3-volume set. Volume 1 is called General, 2 is called Airframes, and 3 is called Engines, I believe. I think it's in that order. And they're very good. They're very good study materials.
Cool.
They're designed as a textbook. They're designed for studying for the A&P exam, but it's very good reading for anybody that swings wrenches on an airplane.
Good. Mark's wondering, what do you think about the FAA maintenance personal minimums checklist?
I am not familiar with the FAA personal minimums checklist. So
FAA maintenance personal minimums checklist. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. I have not seen it.
Okay. Ray is asking, is the FAA regulation to do a post-flight checkout after an annual inspection, or is it a good common sense thing to do? Is it a regulation to do post-maintenance test flight, or is good common sense is what he's asking?
There is a regulation. The regulation is in Part 91. I wish I could quote the exact reg, but it's I'm pretty sure it's 91.4 something. And it's an interesting reg in that it is so broadly worded that nobody knows what it means. But it's basically a regulation that requires that an aircraft that has undergone maintenance or alteration that could appreciably affect its performance or flight characteristics is required to have a post-maintenance test flight performed with only required flight crew aboard, which for most of us means just the pilot, without passengers, and the test flight needs to be logged. The two unanswered questions are, first of all, what kind of maintenance meets that standard, meets the standard of being able to appreciably affect performance or flight characteristics. Now, certain kinds of maintenance clearly meet that test. If you put upgraded the 150 horsepower engine on your Skyhawk to a 180 horsepower engine, or you put vortex generators on it, or a stall kit or something like that, that clearly appreciably affects performance or flight characteristics because it's designed to do that. So clearly anything like that requires a post-maintenance test flight. But what about if you just pull the engine and had it overhauled and put it back on? Is that appreciably affect performance or flight characteristics? Well, maybe not, unless somebody made a mistake. So, it's kind of hard to determine what sort of maintenance meets that standard. Some kinds of maintenance clearly meet the standard. For most kinds of maintenance, it's very ambiguous. The other thing that's a little ambiguous is the question of who's supposed to decide whether the post-maintenance test flight is or is not required after any particular kind of maintenance. The FAA doesn't say. I think, in my mind, the answer is pretty clear because the regulation appears in Part 91. It does not appear in Part 43. Part 91 speaks to pilots and aircraft owners. Part 43 speaks to mechanics. So that the fact that the regulation is in Part 91 and not in Part 43 says to me that the FAA's intent is that the aircraft owner is the person who makes the decision as to whether a post-maintenance test flight is or is not required under that regulation. But again, it's not entirely explicitly clear. I only, infer that from the fact that it appears in Part 91.
Randy sent us a link to the FAA website that have those handbook manuals, the maintenance manuals online, which are downloadable. And I think I copied and pasted it. So everybody, I think, should receive that link that Randy had sent. So hopefully that is useful to people. And question here from Drew. If an aircraft's annual expires on December 31st and an annual inspection is started on December 1st, but is not completed, may the aircraft fly to another facility before the end of the month, i.e. does the start of a formal inspection wipe the slate clean and invalidate the previous annual expiration date?
The airplane may not be flown. The general rule in maintenance is that the act of committing maintenance on an airplane always grounds the airplane. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about an oil change or we're talking about an annual inspection or whether we're talking about an engine change. The act of committing any sort of maintenance on an airplane grounds the airplane. What ungrounds the airplane after the maintenance is concluded is an authorized signature. And the unauthorized signature on a maintenance record entry, or we'll colloquially call it on a logbook entry, although it doesn't have to be in a logbook. Whose signature that can be depends on what kind of maintenance was performed. So if it's an oil change is maintenance that a pilot-rated aircraft owner is allowed to perform himself. So it's the aircraft owner's signature on a logbook entry that approves the aircraft for return to service. If it's a repair, it will require the signature of an A&P or a certified repair station. If it's annual inspection, it's going to require the signature of an IA or a certified repair station. But the general rule is always that the act of committing maintenance on an aircraft, and by the way, inspection is part of the definition of maintenance includes inspection. So an inspection is maintenance. So the act of committing maintenance grounds an airplane. An authorized signature ungrounds the airplane. So if the annual is started, it doesn't matter whether that annual is started 3 weeks after the previous annual or 13 months after the previous annual. The act of starting that inspection grounds the airplane, and the only thing that will unground it is, in the case of an annual, an IA signature.
Randy's wondering, do the shops charge the same amount or maybe even more for an owner-assisted inspections? Seems like this might slow an A&P down.
It might. I've personally never encountered a case where a shop charged more for an owner-assisted annual. They often don't charge less for the reason that you state. Obviously, a shop can charge whatever it wants to for whatever, but a shop that wants to discourage owner-assisted annuals typically just doesn't allow them. Shop that wants to encourage owner-assisted annuals because they like maintenance-involved owners will typically not penalize you for doing an owner-assisted annual.
Okay, we're getting close to the end here. We got a couple questions, a little bit off topic here. I don't know if you want to tackle them. We got a little bit of time here.
Haven't they all been off topic?
Oh, let's see. We're giving you a good workout tonight then. Richard is wondering, is it legal for a mechanic or owner to manufacture a part for his airplane when a replacement is not available or when the replacement is too expensive?
It is, well, it's a complicated question. I actually did a whole webinar on the subject of owner-produced parts. I'll give you a very short version of it. It is generally not legal for a mechanic to produce a replacement part for a certificated aircraft. It is generally legal for the owner to produce the part. And it is legal for the owner to enlist the mechanic to assist him in producing the part. But the producer of the part needs to be the aircraft owner. And the usual reason for owner-produced parts is because a factory part is not available, but there's nothing in the regs that says you can only do owner-produced parts if the factory part is not available. And if the owner decides that he would rather produce the part than spend the exorbitant money that Textron Aviation wants to charge for it, he's perfectly able to do that. The part that he produces needs to be airworthy, and he needs to be able to demonstrate that it's airworthy, that it in fact has the same form, fit, and function as the part that it replaces. And how hard or easy it is to demonstrate the airworthiness of the owner-produced part varies dramatically with what kind of part it is. So an owner-produced wing spar would be a tough nut to crack. An owner-produced door handle would be easy. So it really depends. But owners have the authority to produce parts for their aircraft. Mechanics generally do not have that authority.
Okay, last question here from Richard. Are induction air filters changed on condition or invariably at each annual? Many planes do not fly a lot, and it often seems like new air filters are changed just because of the annual inspection.
Well, first of all, there's no regulation one way or the other. Different kinds of air filters are changed at different intervals. The classic corrugated paper type of air filter typically, at least in my experience, most of them get replaced at 500-hour intervals or something, which for many airplanes could be many, many years. On the other hand, bracket air filters, which are the ones that are made of it's kind of an oil-soaked sponge. Those are typically changed at each annual. They're very cheap, and they're not meant to be in service for very long. But there isn't any regulation that requires you to change those things at any particular interval, or just recommendations. And an annual inspection, and this is another 1 hour discussion that I'll have in 30 seconds, but an annual inspection is just an inspection. It does not include any maintenance or preventive maintenance. So there's nothing about an annual inspection that requires anything to be done. An oil change, a filter change, none of that has anything to do with the annual inspection. Now, preventive maintenance is often done at annual inspection time just because the airplane's all opened up and it's a convenient time to do it. But there's nothing about an annual inspection that requires any maintenance whatsoever, except in response to discrepancies that are found during the inspection. An annual inspection is simply a visual inspection of the aircraft and a documenting of any airworthiness discrepancies found in the course of that visual inspection. That's all it is.
Great way to finish up here, Mike. Wonderful presentation tonight. Please take a moment and share your closing thoughts.
Okay. Well, kind of the usual. Sign up for my monthly e-newsletter if you aren't already on the list. You can do it at the website, savvyaviation.com. There's a sign up for newsletter thing up at the top of the screen. Or if you stick around, as I hope you will, for the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to put up, there'll be a checkbox on the survey that you can check and get on my e-newsletter list. It comes out once a month. It covers various maintenance-related things. My 2 books now are available at Amazon, and there'll also be a limited quantity of them will be available for sale at AirVenture, not by me, but by EAA and Aircraft Spruce if you're coming to AirVenture. Upcoming webinars. The next one is a week later than usual. Normally, my webinars are the first Wednesday of each month. This month, of course, we wound up on a Tuesday because Wednesday was the 4th of July. Next, in August, the first Wednesday of the month is August 1st, and I'm not going to have recovered from AirVenture by then. So it's going to be Wednesday, August 8th. Titled "What's Changed, What Hasn't," where I take a look back at the things that have changed, particularly in the area of aircraft engines over the 50 some odd years that I've been flying, and reflect on things that have changed, things that haven't changed, and why they haven't changed, and so on. Just kind of a historical look. September webinar will be called Inside the Crankcase, where we talk about the crankcase, crankshaft, camshaft, all of the stuff that's inside the engine that you normally can't see until except when you split the case apart, bearings and so on. We'll be talking about that. And then in October, we'll be doing a webinar on turbocharging systems. And I'm going to try to focus on some accident reports that I've been reading lately of pilots that turned what should have been a very minor problem, the failure of a turbocharger, into a life-threatening emergency because they never learned properly how to handle a turbocharger failure as in flight. So that's what we're going to be doing, and that's all I have, Tim.
Oh, great stuff. Looking forward to September 5th, Inside the Crankcase. That'll be a good webinar, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to learning a lot on that one. Mike, thank you so much for volunteering and being a part of the webinars and sharing your information and your time with us tonight. Wonderful presentation. And to everybody who tuned in tonight, thank you all so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. See you next time.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Hope to see some of you at AirVenture in a couple of weeks.